Welcome back to the Road to Emmaus journey, and we're excited that you're with us again today. Today we're looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and the context of this really is Paul defending his apostleship, which is a little odd because Paul seems to me to be like the consummate Christian. He's been on right at the top of my list of heroes of the faith, just how does he do ministry and stuff like that. And he spends a lot of 2 Corinthians defending himself as an apostle, which is a little awkward, and it's awkward as he goes through that. But we get to this chapter, and this is kind of a strange chapter because he starts kind of in the third person and kind of weaves in. It turns out that Paul apparently had some pretty remarkable visions and an experience where he was taken up into, the third heaven, and he comes down and he's building this because all these other super apostles are talking about their experiences. But he gets to this interesting point. I think this sometimes goes against the grain of what we think about in Christianity today. Verse 7, he says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me and to keep me from becoming conceited." This is really hard for us to deal with. What was this thorn in the flesh? Was it a physical ailment? Was it maybe his blindness? He talks about that in some other books, that his eyesight was really bad, or maybe he stuttered as he spoke like Moses did. Or maybe it was a struggle with a particular sin. We don't know that at all. Or it could be just the constant persecution that he faced, just constantly. I think probably it was some sort of an ailment, and a lot of commentators would lean in that direction. But the interesting thing is God allows Paul this remarkable vision of God. And I don't know if it took place on the road to Damascus, or those days that he was fasting afterwards, or while he was in Tarsus, kind of life on hold between Acts 9 and Acts 11. Maybe it was in Acts 14 outside the city of Lystra where he was stoned, probably to death, maybe to death. And then I would say raised from the dead. So we don't know when this happened, but God allowed him to see the inner sanctums of heaven, apparently. And then he said, you can't talk about some of this. And then he gives him a thorn in the flesh to keep him conceited, or to keep him from getting conceited. That issue of men and women of God who have great revelations of God, and then pride is a concern in the church today. In fact, Paul, when he talks about the qualifications for elders, he says, don't make somebody an elder real quick, particularly if they're a new believer, because they might become conceited like the devil and fall. And that pride was that first sin. And we've got to be concerned about pride with our leaders. And if God's giving you a gift, as God's giving you success in ministry, he's very concerned that the glory goes to him and not to ourselves. And so he allows these things in our lives, whether it's persecution or a struggle with sin, or maybe it's a physical ailment, in order to keep Paul, in this case, humble. And so as we look at these great men and women of God, we've got to remember that with that greatness, often God allows this little thing to plague them, and we should pray for them because of that. I can think of two women right just off the top of my head who are maybe the most spiritual people I know. One of them is in our church, and both of them are prayer warriors. And if anybody can just immediately be in the presence of God, I know theologically we say that we can always access the throne room of grace immediately, but Sharon and Jan, they can just, boom, they're in the presence of God. But if you know their stories, you know that their lives have been difficult, and their understanding and their ability to walk in and out of the presence of God is based on, sometimes it's even based on this difficulty. So just here at the church, one of these women she's always a go-to. She's like a bodyguard for the elders. And I just really feel like she is in touch with the Lord. This other lady, Sharon, mentored my wife and I. She's been a great staple at Camp Elam and just a great woman of God, but they have these significant thorns in the flesh. One is crippled, one is deaf, and very difficult other areas in life. So I think we need to be careful just as we look at these trials, particularly when God has given us some great gift or ministry or ability, is that God does not want us to become conceited like the devil. But then here comes the great part. And we all know this verse, I think, and I love this idea. So Paul says, Lord, please take this away from me. 3 times he prayed. And the Lord's response to him, and if you got a red letter version of your Bible, it's probably in red, says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of God may rest on me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamity. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So when we are at our lowest, this has been a rough season for me. And so as I'm at my lowest, often then God's like, okay, now, Andy, you're out of the way. I can work my fullest. My grace, his divine influence is sufficient. It's overflowing. It's surpassing when I'm at my weakest point. It's perfected. It's consummated when I'm at my weak point. And so whether we're praying for our leaders or we're considering God's work in our lives, it's astonishing, but it's also amazing that when we're just struggling through and seeking God, often that's when he works the most powerfully and the greatest through us. So I want to encourage you that let's pray for those that are up in front, that have the great gifts, for power and strength and humility and courage, but also just as we consider our lives, when we're struggling the most, very possibly God is working the most in us. So this is the Road to Emmaus journey. We're glad that you joined us today. I encourage you to take a good read through 2 Corinthians 12.